Welcome to the second part of Byline Times US election special. We've already spoken to Bonnie Greer about the role of Trump and Kamala and the different stereotypes of men and women that are taking place in this election. These truths will remain and affect American society probably for years to come. We're now joined by a great Byline Times writer, investigator, and author, Nafeez Ahmed. For us, for the last 6 years, I think, he's been looking at these networks, international networks, which stretch from Trump to Brexit, to Putin, to gas and fossil fuel giants, dark money, think tanks. Yes, the whole network of stuff. And this is coming together in a book which is out soon called Alt-Reich. Now, I'm not going to give away the contents of that book, Nafeez, we can leave our audience and readers wanting more. But what is your big impression going into this election? We don't know the results yet, but we're talking about things which will be separate from the results, which will remain permanent. What does this reveal to you over the last really 3 months of the campaign since Kamala Harris has taken over the candidacy for the Democrats?
Well, I think the United States has become a bit of a crucible now for the way in which discourse around politics in the West has evolved. You look to the States and you get an idea of what are the battle lines actually. And it's become really clear that the extent of polarization between left and right is becoming really extreme and dangerously so. And I think what we're seeing is an increasing propensity, especially on parts of the right, to believe that going beyond the norm, even extraordinary acts of violence, are actually okay in order to pursue your agenda. And this is a narrative that we've seen the Trump campaign and the first Trump administration and various backers of Trump, whether it's funders or think tanks, they've openly and increasingly moved into this space where they've questioned the legitimacy of the electoral process. But that's just the beginning. It's not just that there's an election being stolen. We now have openly a conversation happening at that level saying, do we want democracy actually? Do we really need it?
Well, Trump's made that clear. This could be the last election you'll ever need.
Yes, that kind of rhetoric has become par for the course. I've found it extraordinary to see how ordinary Americans are able to listen to that kind of rhetoric and say, yeah, that's okay. I can deal with that. I can't imagine what it would be like in the UK if a politician said, should we just forget democracy, actually. It's extraordinary that it's got to that point. So there is a real tipping point in the discourse that this kind of, let's call it what it is, it's fascist discourse has become normal. It's become ordinary. And that's what worries me, that after the elections, no matter who wins, that has become now an agenda-setting discourse. It's become the playing field in which all of us are now having a conversation. And that's one of the dangers of this emerging movement that we've seen all over the world, is that even if it doesn't win elections, it actually changes the parameters of how we think and speak. And that's really dangerous.
I want to bring Hardeep in here, editor of Byline Times, my boss. I'm the co-founder, by the way. And we're going to write an essay. We are in the middle of writing an essay about Kamala Harris's one of her closing speeches about a pluribus unum, about pluralism. Now, the opposite of that, the populism, and Trump's made this clear, there's no wider coalition. You kill your enemies, you marginalize them, you lock them up, lock her up. There isn't that sense that people are being persuaded they are existentially against you. Now, you had a profound moment. I didn't agree, partly because I sensed that something else would happen, but when the assassination attempt happened in Pennsylvania, and these pictures of Trump covered with blood, going fight, 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 you felt that had kind of shifted the zeitgeist of the campaign. You thought he might win on that basis. That not reveal that somewhere deep in the American myth, unlike maybe the British myth, is our assassinations and are these foundational acts of violence which define the cowboy, define the Civil War, define whatever happened to the Native Americans, the founding of America.
I mean, as we were talking with Bonnie, I think this notion of performance and what the person who becomes the president represents is very important to the American people in terms of their psyche. It's an internalization of what they feel America to be. But at that point, the assassination attempt occurred. Joe Biden was still the Democrat candidate. And I think that my view did shift when Kamala Harris overtook him and indeed is the candidate. She symbolizes, I think, strength, a notion of freedom, which is very important to America, and moving things forward rather than going back, which is in a very strong contrast to Trump. But Trump has been talking about the enemies within. So he's been saying that they're the real people we need to be wary of, not just China and Russia.
And Mexico.
Yeah, and he has this long list of groups of people that you would think he wants to take vengeance on if he wins a second term. Now, Kamala Harris has used that very language to make the point of you can disagree. It doesn't mean someone's your enemy. America is at its best a pluralistic democracy, and pluralism is inherently accepting of difference. Democracy should also be inherently accepting of difference. We're not always going to agree. It doesn't mean we're enemies. We have more in common and we can find common ground. But I think this point about, as Nafeez says, what the discussion around democracy has degenerated into. I think our democracies in both the US, the UK are vulnerable because I'm not sure how much of that pluralism, that aspect of democracy, which is about we're going to have differences, but this is the method by which we're going to have those play out and to come to some resolution on common ground. I'm not sure how much that principle is actually alive and well in the two democracies of America and Britain. And so all of this reveals something much more fundamental anyway that is a concern. And it's not that long ago we had Boris Johnson lying to Parliament, doing all sorts of things that people couldn't believe. We had riots this summer. So this notion of pluralism, people not being your enemies, but this extreme polarization, I agree with Nafeez. I don't think we're just going to see that evaporate if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, or if indeed we now have a Labour government.
So that begs a question in my mind about what's happened in the last 4 years since the last insurrection. And I have to full declaration of a friend of the family who was a Capitol police officer committed suicide afterwards. There's quite a personal sense of loss and chaos there. But the strategy has been, hasn't it, a lot of legal process, numerous legal cases. Some are pending not to interfere with the election. The Mar-a-Lago case, him having confidential documents, him apparently trying to overturn the result in Georgia. But obviously he was found guilty, Trump, of 37 felonies in New York relating to hush payments. Has this backfired, Nafeez? Because one of the things I notice about the online discourse, if you follow the MAGA, they think they're saving democracy. They think all these institutions are cheating. And the most crucial, maybe that could be relevant for the weeks ahead, is where the electoral process works. But they think the rule of law, that he's being particularly targeted by district attorneys or the Department of Justice, and it's a witch hunt, it's a crusade. Was there any other solution other than these cases? Should there be more forcible actually get him locked up or indicted? Or in a way, have they fallen into the trap in terms of the American justice system? It's now seen by a large proportion of Americans as being partial, as being part of a blob, part of a conspiracy against them.
So I think this has become such an entrenched issue, and it reveals, in my view, that the solution really isn't in the law or even in the standard process of democracy as we understand it. That is not the answer, because this is something else. There's something else going on. To this point about why it is that people can watch the specter of this person be criminally prosecuted in the public eye and be completely immune to it. I think that's, again, it's a tipping point in the thought process of so many Americans, where the way that they are thinking about these things has now become almost permanently disfigured.
So just to stop you there, the guy who committed suicide, his father, Howard Lieberman, prosecuted a Republican, prosecuted Nixon. So at that moment in the 1970s, both sides accepted he broke the rule of law and kind of accepted the result, though some said he shouldn't have been pardoned. You think we've moved on from that massively?
Well, I think there's been a deliberate effort by a network of people like Elon Musk, people like Peter Thiel, and there's other think tanks. Some of these are even mainstream centers of conservative thinking like the Heritage Foundation. They're not fringe groups. They are actively attempting to say that the law and the Constitution and all the things that most Americans would say is foundational to American democracy are all up for grabs and not fit for purpose. And they've extended that to everything. It's the media, it's government, it's every government agency, it's anyone who is remotely affiliated, it's DEI. If you say anything about diversity, then you're also one of them. And in fact, if you're brown or black or Hispanic, then you also might be lumped into one of them. It's this huge blob, and it's an ideology, and that's how fascism works. It creates a set of ideas which are so fixed that you can't negotiate with them, and everything fits. It's a conspiracy theory.
And the great thing is, in those conspiracy, people used to say this about Marxism and early Freudianism. If you object to it or have you quit, you're part of the problem.
Absolutely.
You're part of the conspiracy. So it's got this closed loop. And can we add into that conspiracy, because it seems to be quite a big part of it, with RFK Jr. running, anti-science. He wants to get rid of fluoride. Anti-medicine. He's against big pharma and COVID vaccination. It's like they piled all these conspiracy self-reference into one.
How do you think it's evolved, Nafeez, from traditionally how we think of fascism, the 1930s, the Nazis? How would you say what's going on today has parallels but is different?
So it's interesting because when I've traced a lot of these groups, actually in the book, Alt-Reich, I found that a lot of the groups that we're looking at are traditional anti-Semitic organizations. And one of them at the center of this, which recently resurfaced in Hope Not Hate's investigation, is the Pioneer Fund. Now, my book actually shows how the Pioneer Fund, which was basically a Nazi foundation set up in New York in the 1930s, had direct links to Nazi Germany, even people involved in the Auschwitz death camps. It was extraordinary. That group made a tactical effort to legitimize itself and to reframe the way we understand race, multiculturalism, and they made a very concerted effort to distance themselves from being associated with Nazism. Because don't forget, Nazism was defeated militarily. Everyone hated Nazis. So you couldn't go around saying, we are card-carrying Nazis. You had to say, actually, no, we hate Nazis too. But what about black people who are a problem? Do we really want to give them civil rights? What about race science? What about the fact that these guys actually have inferior genes and are all these immigrants in bringing their inferior IQ into our society? So these ideas were quite commonplace. There were mixed views about them. There were debates, but very commonplace in the 30s. But after 1945, were largely seen as fringe and largely debunked scientifically. Most scientists had rejected this just through research. In the next few decades, what we've seen is that the nexus around that made a deliberate effort to literally infiltrate Republican circles, mainstream conservative Republican circles, think tanks. The Heritage Foundation was at the center of this. And what I was astonished to see is the Heritage Foundation nexus was the same nexus that worked with Sir Anthony Fisher to found the Tufton Street network of organizations. It was literally a pipeline. And the same pipeline, they actually shipped Charles Murray, who was the author of the Bible of scientific racism called The Bell Curve, saying that black people are basically stupider than white people and there's nothing you can do about it. And this should inform all of policy and everything. This guy was shipped over to Britain by Rupert Murdoch, of all people. He wrote pieces in the Sunday Times about welfare policy. He met Margaret Thatcher personally. He met loads and loads of people in Number 10. And it was the Institute of Economic Affairs, that is now a hard Brexit think tank, that platformed him. Is that just a strange accident? My argument is that it wasn't an accident. It wasn't necessarily a conspiracy in the sense of there was a very well thought out plan, but these were institutions that were very well connected. So I think that we're seeing the legacy of this kind of thing today, where we see real hardcore racism is repackaging itself as we're anti-racist actually, and we're just all about this and all about that. We're all about defending the nation. We're all about defending sovereignty. They're trying to find ways to repackage themselves, and they've built an alliance. And there are most people in this network have no idea that their understanding of conservatism is being shifted to the right in a very extreme way. Most of them are probably anti-Nazi and probably are genuinely against racism. They don't realize that at the core of this, there are groups of people who genuinely believe that there are genetically based biological inequalities which should determine all of policy.
So that's borne out in recent weeks by Trump keep on repeating bad genes are coming in from migrants, which is kind of...
Kamala Harris, he said something about her having a low IQ as well.
And then the idea this gene pool is being mixed with migrants, let alone the optics of the Madison Square Garden rally, which were horribly reminiscent both in tone and in visuals of the famous Nazi rally in 1939. We haven't got that long to discover this, but I'm just on that analogy, and we talk about it a lot. We talked about it with this other book, John Bloomfield and David Edgar, about the fascist word. One distinction that people have made between the fascism of the 30s, and we're not just talking about Nazism, we're talking about the Phalange in Spain, the fascists in Italy, well, there aren't the street armies, there aren't the militias, the conscripts. And my argument back, and maybe it's born from your idea of network war, Nafeez, is you don't need them in the time of networks. There is an online information war which does almost the same as the street violence did in the 30s. Is that one of your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think that fascism has changed and evolved. And it would be a mistake to think that we're just looking at the same fascism. It's not the same. It's fundamentally different. It's tactically shifted. It's a kind of postmodern form of fascism. But it is fascism nonetheless. And in a traditional sense, you're looking at a movement right now in the United States, which is quite openly attempting to combine state and corporate power in a shockingly crazy way. Having Elon Musk there, the richest man in the world, saying that he's going to set up the government office of efficiency and take control of the economy. And at the same time, they're saying they're going to build an infrastructure to expel 20 million migrants, which is on a scale that rival Hitler's wildest dreams in Nazi Germany. I mean, he created a devastating apparatus there, but this is a vastly different scale. And I think that's the strange thing, that we see this intersection of ideas, and it doesn't necessarily need shock troops on the ground. But I think what I'm worried about is that when you have a radicalization process like this, it can get out of control. And I think this is what people underestimate. It's very difficult to accept the idea that rapid and dramatic change can happen that quickly. But I think if we've learned anything over the last few years, it's that expect the unexpected. I mean, I didn't think Trump was going to win the 2016 elections. I remember when he first stood up there and he released his first video. It was hilarious. He looked like an idiot. But it didn't matter. It was very effective. And that's kind of what we're seeing.
And 2020, of course, he lost, but there was a major insurrection attempt, people killed, to overturn the vote of the Capitol insurrection.
Yes, and I think that's the key thing, is that we're seeing that this resort to violence and the legitimization of violence is becoming a normalized part of the Republican campaign. It's actually okay for Trump to tell everybody that he thinks Liz Cheney, a Republican, should be in the firing line. And he wasn't even saying it as a joke. He didn't.
9 rifles should be trained on her. She'd change her mind or something.
And I think the thing is, like, again, the supporters of Trump will say, well, he just said it offhand. They'll have all sorts of reasons that he maybe didn't mean it. But that sort of language has become extremely commonplace. It's become normal. And it's not just about Liz Cheney. I mean, they've talked about using violence against the left. And there's an extraordinary book that was just published this year by Jack Posobiec. He co-authored it with someone I don't remember, called Unhumans, which really sets out the dangerous nature of this ideology, where he basically talks about anyone who essentially disagrees with...
It's non-human.
Yeah, it's a subhuman. So it's based on this fabricated history of communist revolutions, and essentially paints anyone on the left, anyone who is a Democrat, anyone who is not on board with this project, as basically unhuman. And a lot of people who have reviewed that book in the New York Times, elsewhere, have noticed that it really does remind them of the kind of text they were seeing in Nazi Germany at the time. It's very similar, that level of dehumanization. After all of that, there's a disclaimer at the end which says, oh, but we don't believe in anything illegal, something like that. As if you'd have to put that in. Why would you have to put that into a book?
But, when we talk about political violence, Nafeez, I mean, they're different countries, and I'm very cautious about making generalizations, because I think the political cultures of the United Kingdom and the United States are very different. But we did see violence on the streets of many cities this summer, very soon after a landslide general election for the Labour Party. And obviously on Byline Times, we've managed to show those networks, and many of them are online as well. And Nafeez, you've illuminated how far-reaching and global this is. But is there anything of interest, of note, about what happened here this summer and potentially what could be in store for America, whatever happens in this election?
Well, I think it's absolutely clear that whatever happens, if Kamala does win, that is not going to be accepted by the Republicans. It's made it absolutely clear. And there has been a very concerted strategy to prepare to call the elections into question. It's been planned. They're open about it almost. They're looking at all the swing states. They're scrutinizing all of the electoral processes. And they're looking at where they can identify any discrepancy at all. Whether it has any actual meaning or not, it doesn't matter. But if they can find a discrepancy in order to create a crisis. This is a playbook that we saw Trump execute and people around him very precisely in 2020.
Stop the steal, Roger Stone.
He actually very precisely targeted the swing states. They attempted to create a constitutional crisis. They almost did. It was complex with the way they executed it, but the simple idea was as long as you can create a perception that there is a doubt, then you can say in Congress that there's grounds to not accept the result. Mm-hmm. And that was what they were trying to do. And more than that, there was even evidence of efforts to prepare to actually take military power. There was even conversations around seizing voting booths and things like that. In fact, interestingly, Patrick Byrne, who is a multimillionaire election denialist who's been funding insurrectionists, he was actually in the White House a couple of weeks and a couple of days before the insurrection took place. He was one of the people who famously, along with Michael Flynn, who has huge Russian connections, advised Trump and people around him that we should just seize the voting booths. And
he's now in Dubai, isn't he? He's fled to Dubai.
Is he in Dubai?
Yes, it's because
I did not know.
But he was, as you pointed out in a great article for us in Byline Times after the summer riots, a major funder of a certain Stephen Yaxley Lennon, yeah?
Yes, that's right. That's what I
Tommy
was
Robinson.
getting to. So there is that weird international network where you've got insurrectionists in the States working with far-right activists here. And I think what makes this worrying is that, of course, we know that most of the people who actually did what they did were already criminals. You know, they had that kind of record. We now know that. But what's alarming is the mainstream voices, people like Douglas Murray, people like Nigel Farage, who are able to sit there and actually say, well, I have kind of agree with the sentiments behind this. I understand why people were rising up and not saying anything about threatening people's lives and actually demolishing buildings and setting fire to buildings. They didn't really have much to say about that, except a few, we condemn the violence, but. And I think that, again, the normalization of, well, this is what we expect. This is legitimate. People are upset. They are going to do this. We understand. We don't agree, but we understand. That's very, very dangerous. And it's trying to shift the way people think about the violence.
And a very chilling Stephen Yaxley Lennon on various videos saying, we are the media now. So again, that notion of you can't trust the established media. We're the media now. This is where we're going to tell you the truth, which is really worrying.
Well, they're not the media now. We're the media now. And Nafeez's book will be out in about a month. And we're going to do a series of podcasts and interviews around that, where we could explore in real time, perhaps, Nafeez, how these conspiracies, these fascistic overtones of violence, anti-democratic forces will manifest themselves in the next 3 months. Meanwhile, we'll be back with a third part of our US election specials very soon with the author and Byline Times columnist Sonia Purnell, who's been in America for the last 2 months and may have some more positive news about the up-and-coming election.